Joining me now is NBC News correspondent Yamiche Alcindor, who was in the room for Trump's interview today. Also with me is Jelani Cobb, staff writer at The New Yorker and, of course, dean of the Columbia School of Journalism, and Rashad Robinson, president of the civil rights nonprofit Color of Change. It's so great to have all of you here with me. But Yamiche, let me first start with you. You were in the room. How did Trump's new strategy of questioning Kamala Harris's blackness play to the room of journalists gathered there?
Well, good evening, and I am interested to see what Jelani says, because I was literally sitting right next to him in the room as we both took in this moment. In the room, you had journalists who were, questioning already whether or not it was a good use of the organization's time to bring Donald Trump to the annual convention, because he has questioned democracy and obviously some say really caused January 6th and the Capitol attack to happen. But there were others who were curious about genuinely what he would say, wanted to see him answer questions about how he would impact the black community, how he would win over people, how he could get people to trust them. So it started off with a little bit of tension, but a lot of open minds. And immediately when he started attacking Rachel Scott of ABC News, someone that is a dear colleague of all of ours, people started to gasp and were really stunned by the way that he was talking to her. Even though we've seen him talk that way to a number of other people, a number of our black journalists who are part of this organization, but people were still hoping maybe this time he would have a little bit more decorum. And then when he started attacking Vice President Harris's identity, people just started openly and audibly reacting, saying that's a lie, that's not true. And as someone who's now covering and has been covering Vice President Harris for years now, and now covering her campaign, I can tell you that the clips that you played talking about her parents, she often tells a story about how they met as civil rights activists, how they used to push her in a stroller to go to protests as a little girl. This is someone who has very much articulated not only her identity, but how her identity and her parents, their passion for civil rights, how it impacted her wanting to go and be a prosecutor, wanting to have justice and accountability from inside the criminal justice system. So there were a lot of people in the room who were frankly angry and were frankly wondering whether or not this was the best use of time right now for people. I was one of the journalists who was texting people in the Harris campaign and sources close to the Harris campaign, because I wanted to know what they were how they were reacting. And I got back people saying that Donald Trump was unhinged, that it was below the belt even for him to question her identity because of how clear she's been. I have to remind people, not only did she go to Howard University, historically black college, but she also joined the nation's first historically black sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha Sorority Incorporated. So she has been someone who has long been someone who's cherished her African American identity, her black identity, as well as her Indian American identity. So it was really a sight to behold. I've seen a lot of remarkable things covering former President Trump, but today was really just, I think it stood out.
Yeah, it is something to behold, even if you weren't in the room. And Dean Cobb, of course, you were at the Get This convention, given your role at the Columbia School of Journalism. I do wonder, this is a strategy. This wasn't just Donald Trump mouthing off. This is something they repeated they have a screen ready, a projector shot ready at the rally. They have Alina Habba echoing Trump's questioning of Kamala Harris's blackness. It's as if, as impossible as this may be to believe, Donald Trump doesn't understand the long legacy of racism associated with questioning people's blackness.
That's right.
I mean, it is just a staggering oversight. But then should we expect more from the Trump campaign? What are your thoughts about all of this?
So listen, first off, to Yamiche's point, this was very much reminiscent almost of a comedian trying out new material. In the time since Kamala Harris has become the presumptive nominee, you've seen the people on their side really struggle to figure out what to say about her or how to approach this. And so it seemed as if they were just trotting out the next thing. Well, let's just say she's not really a black person. That betrays a stunning ignorance of African Americans, certainly stunning ignorance of African American history. There's a very long history of people who would be technically categorized as multiracial, who are considered African American. We went through, Frederick Douglass, for that matter, W.E.B. Du Bois, Eartha Kitt. We went through the entire list. We'd be talking about virtually half of the people who are in the history books. And so that is something that not only is frankly ignorant, but also inflammatory, and so I don't think that this works, certainly for the audience that he was talking to today, but I think that it was meant to be for an audience that was outside of that room. They're just kind of throwing darts and seeing what sticks and saying things that are insulting and seeing, like literally like a comedian seeing which lines get the laugh.
Yeah, I wonder what you think of it as a strategy, Rashad. And by the way, it is a multi-pronged strategy. It's not just overtly questioning her blackness. It's also going after code switching. Fox News has a chyron, this was from last night, talking about Kamala Harris's different accents that she uses during rallies. J.D. Vance tonight in Arizona says that Harris put on a Southern accent for a Georgia audience, echoing Fox. Trump tonight said the same thing at his rally in Pennsylvania. This is all part of a portfolio of questioning how black she really is. Is this,
and it's rich,
is this what's been missing?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Rashad.
Well, it's rich because we end up not talking about any of the issues. We end up not talking about the challenges that this country is facing and where we are heading. And, to Jelani's point, right, part of Trump's strategy is sort of a long-standing Republican strategy of, Republicans going into these black spaces, not always to recruit new black voters or recruit new black supporters, but sometimes signaling to white moderates that, they're willing to go and be around the black people. They're willing to speak directly to these audiences which may not be supportive, that they're not necessarily racist the way that they might be getting sort of labeled based off of their policies or based off of their practices or based off of who they hire and who they engage with. And so this is a long-standing strategy. And I do think it's important that underneath the lies, the outrageous things that Trump says, that we continue to also stay focused on some of the things that he sometimes says that can possibly break through. So in that conversation, he's doing also this longstanding sort of attack on immigrants and really trying to speak directly to black voters, where he's sort of blaming immigration for economic challenges that the black community may be facing, and not talking about sort of the role of corporations, the role of the Trump tax cuts, the role of all of these different factors which have actually led to the ways in which our economy may not be producing for everyone at that level, and the work that actually has to be done. And so we actually have to do the work to make sure people understand that when those Trump tax cuts expire next year, we want a Kamala Harris at the table to negotiate with and to push forward and to do the work to actually move us forward. It's also just rich to have, his vice presidential nominee, J.D. Vance, follow this up, given that he has biracial children. It's a kind of sick that he would play along with this as someone who claims to want to be a good father and talks about being a good family man, that he would allow this, three-time cheater on his wife, someone with 5 children by 3 different women, to get up and put him in this position as to make attacks and level attacks that would actually attack his own family.
Yeah, I will say, as a mixed race person myself, the thing about being mixed race is you can be 2 things at once, and there are a lot of us in America who understand that. Donald Trump apparently is not one of them.